The rain arrives first, not the gentle kind that makes a field smell sweet, but late August rain, cold, sharp, impatient, like the sky is trying to erase what's about to happen. It sweeps across the low country of northern France and turns the ground into a heavy, clinging paste. Mud that grabs your boots, mud that steals speed, mud that makes every step cost something. And on a small rise near Crécy and Ponthieu, King Edward III of England stands very still and does what leaders have always done in the moments before history moves. He counts. Not on his fingers, in his mind. He measures distance, time, fatigue, and the one truth no crown can argue with: numbers. Down in the valley, beyond the rain haze, the French host is forming. You can't see every face, but you can feel the mass of it. Banners and lances, horses shifting and stamping, the restless sound of too many men arriving with too much confidence. France is home. France is fresh. France is bigger. And France believes the world still works the old way. Edward is not fresh. He is tired in the deep grinding way you only get after weeks of marching and raiding. His army has cut across Normandy in what the age calls a chevauchée, fast, punishing destruction meant to prove a political point, that the French king cannot protect his own land. It's strategy by humiliation, and it leaves smoke behind you like a signature. Now the signature has been noticed. Edward has been trying to reach the safety of friendly ports. He has been trying to keep his army intact long enough to choose the next move. But France has finally caught up, and the valley below is filling with the answer. He looks at the slope he chose and studies it like a craftsman studies raw timber. It isn't a dramatic cliff or a heroic ridge. It's just better. Better than the flat ground below. Better for tired men who need something the enemy has to spend strength to reach. The hill forces the French to climb for every advantage they want to claim. To a modern eye, it's the first lesson of this day. Terrain is not scenery. Terrain is a weapon. Edward turns his head slowly, scanning his own line. It doesn't look like a parade. No tidy perfection for an artist. It looks like work. Hard, practical work done under pressure. Archers in damp hoods check their strings. Men at arms shift into tighter ranks. Someone hammers sharpened stakes into the ground at an outward angle. The stakes are ugly, simple things, but they speak a language horses understand instantly. Behind them, shallow ditches and rough ground wait like arguments you can't refute once you're already running. And then Edward makes the decision that will define the afternoon. His knights begin to dismount, not because they fear the French, and not because they've forgotten who they are. They dismount because Edward understands what pride can cost when physics gets involved. A mounted knight is fast until the ground steals speed. A mounted knight is powerful until congestion steals space. A mounted knight is terrifying until his horse can't find traction and his formation collapses into the bodies ahead. Edward doesn't want a glamorous fight. He wants a line that holds. So the nobles step down into the mud, and you can almost hear centuries of tradition protest in the silence. These men have trained from childhood to fight as cavalry, to be the spear point of their class and the proof of their superiority. But Edward is telling them, without shouting, that survival comes before performance. It's an unromantic choice. It's also a modern one. Because Edward, whether he knows the term or not, is building a system that works under chaos. He's thinking less like a tournament champion and more like a commander who understands processes, placement, timing, discipline, supply. In an age where war is often shaped by ego and improvisation, Edward is shaping it with preparation. He divides his force into 3 main bodies and places his archers where their fire can overlap. It's not just about having bows, it's about where those bows stand, what they can see, and how they can support the men holding the center. He makes the hill into a frame, and inside that frame he builds something solid. The longbowmen are not noble. Many are commoners. Some are rough men, practical men, men who have spent their lives pulling heavy yew-staves because English custom and law have made archery a habit. Their bodies carry the evidence, shoulders and backs built by repetition, hands that move with the confidence of craft. In the rain, they handle their bows the way a professional handles a tool. They unstring them to protect the cord from damp, tucking spare strings under clothing to keep them dry. It's a small detail, the kind nobody cheers for, the kind that decides outcomes. Edward walks behind the line, quiet and deliberate. He doesn't need speeches. He needs stillness. He needs every man to feel that the plan is real, that the hill is chosen for a reason, that the stakes are there for a reason, that the enemy will come uphill because the enemy has decided it must. And down below, the French host moves like a shining storm. If Edward's army looks like a tool set arranged for use, Philip's looks like pageantry that has wandered into danger. Banners snap in the wind, fleur-de-lis, personal arms, the bright signatures of powerful families. Metal catches what little light the clouds allow. Riders press forward, eager to be seen, eager to be first, eager to be remembered. Philip VI is there, of course, a kingdom surrounded by kingdom's expectations. He didn't invent the culture that worships the mounted charge, but he must live inside it. He must manage it. And that is harder than marching an army. Because his nobles are not only soldiers, they are rivals, patrons, heirs, men with reputations they believe are on display every minute they are not at the front. Philip can give orders, yes, but medieval command is not modern command. It's persuasion backed by prestige, negotiated in the space between banners and pride. He sees the English on the hill. He sees that they are fewer. He sees that his men are tired from the march, and the smarter move would be to halt, let them rest, attack with a plan in the morning. But tomorrow feels like an insult to men who believe victory is owed to them. And then there is another king in Philip's host, one whose presence turns this field into something that will later feel like legend. John of Bohemia rides with his court, a ruler who cannot see the hill, cannot see the banners, cannot see the mud. Yet he has crossed distance and hardship to be here, because medieval kings are not just administrators, they are symbols. They are expected to be present when history demands witnesses. As the rain eases and the light shifts toward evening, the battlefield takes a breath. The two lines face each other through a thin veil of mist. Edward's line holds. Philip's host swells. And Edward does something that might seem simple, but it is the most decisive choice you can make when you are outnumbered and exhausted. He refuses to move. He refuses the temptation to charge downhill for glory. He refuses the fantasy of a heroic strike. He chooses the unglamorous strength of staying in place, of letting the enemy spend energy and order just to reach him. In modern terms, he's forcing the other side to pay for every mistake at interest. Archers settle their feet. Men-at-arms lock their spacing. The stakes point outward, patient and sharp. The hill waits. Edward looks down the slope one more time. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks focused, like a man holding a door closed while he hears a crowd gathering on the other side. And then he gives the order that will echo through the rest of the day. Not charge, not advance. Just one word spoken like a rule. Hold.
If you want to understand why Crécy matters, don't start with the arrows, start with the systems. Edward III isn't just a king in armor riding on nerve and luck. He's something that feels surprisingly modern for the 14th century, a leader building a military machine that can keep working even when everyone is tired, wet, and scared. He has contracts, pay records, logistics, expectations. In an age where war is often a season of noble adventure, half campaign, half performance, Edward is pushing towards something else. War as an organized profession. And that matters because Edward knows the French have what the medieval world respects most: more knights, more banners, more noble houses ready to prove themselves. If he tries to win by matching that style, by charging, by chasing personal glory, he's playing France's favorite game on France's board. So he doesn't. He looks at the hill, he looks at the mud, and he chooses a plan that will feel almost insulting to the old rules of chivalry. A plan built on restraint, preparation, and repetition. Three things that don't make good songs, but do make good outcomes. Here's the uncomfortable truth Edward is acting on. Bravery is not enough when the other side has 3 times the bodies and the cultural momentum of, "We always win this way." You need something that doesn't depend on a perfect moment. You need something that holds up when the day gets messy. And for England, that advantage isn't a secret weapon, it's a national habit. The longbow isn't complicated to look at. It's wood and string, often yew, tall as a man and plain as a tool. But the real power of the longbow isn't the bow itself. It's the fact that England has spent years, generations really, building the kind of people who can use it well. A skilled longbowman can loose roughly 10 to 12 aimed arrows in a minute, as long as his arms and his breathing hold steady. Not like a machine forever, but long enough to make a battlefield feel like it has weather. And that's the point. At Crécy, Edward isn't trying to win a single clash. He's trying to turn the French advance into a long, exhausting climb through constant pressure. But here's what most people miss. You don't get 10 or 12 good shots a minute with casual training. The draw weight on these bows is heavy. Heavy enough that, over years, it changes a body. Shoulders broaden, backs thicken, hands toughen. It's less like picking up a sword and more like becoming an athlete for one specific motion, repeated until it's written into muscle and bone. So when you see those archers on the ridge, you're not seeing peasants with sticks. You're seeing the outcome of policy, culture, and time. In modern terms, they're a strategic capability that took decades to build. And Edward knows it. So he builds the battlefield around them. He divides his force into 3 main bodies, his battles, and he places the archers where they matter most, on the flanks, angled so their shots overlap across the slope. It's not just a line of bows, it's a geometry problem the French will have to solve while climbing uphill in mud. Overlapping fields of fire. It sounds technical, but what it means on the ground is simple. If you move into the kill zone, you're not taking arrows from one direction, you're taking them from several. And that multiplies confusion, breaks timing, and forces men to bunch up, exactly what cavalry cannot afford to do. Edward also prepares the ground in ways that look small until they suddenly aren't. Shallow ditches, rough pits, sharpened stakes angled outward. None of it is glamorous, all of it is brutally practical. These aren't decorations, they are there to slow horses, split formations, and make a clean charge impossible. Then comes a decision that shocks both sides. Edward orders his knights to dismount. For centuries, the mounted knight has been the symbol of how war works. To fight on foot is what infantry does. It's what commoners do. It's what men do when they've been forced down from glory. But Edward doesn't do it as a humiliation. He does it as a calculation. A knight on foot is slower, yes, but he's also steadier. He can anchor a line. He can hold a position without the chaos of horses colliding in mud. And in a defensive battle, on a hill, behind stakes, steadiness is worth more than speed. If the French imagine the fight as a break-in, one big shove that splinters the door, Edward is building a door that won't splinter, a door braced from behind, strengthened at the hinges, with the ground itself set up to trip anyone who runs at it too hard. And when the English nobles step down into the mud, the symbolism is unmistakable. Nobles and commoners begin to look less like separate worlds and more like parts of one machine. That's another modern lesson hiding inside this medieval moment. Armies win when they work as systems, not when they act as social hierarchies. Edward's line tightens. Men settle into their places. Archers check strings, keep them dry, prepare spare cords. Stakes are hammered into position. Everything is quiet in the way a workshop gets quiet right before the first strike of a hammer. Edward doesn't need to scream or swagger. He needs the opposite. He needs calm that spreads, a plan that feels solid enough for exhausted men to lean on. Because down in the valley, France is arriving with something else entirely. France is arriving with confidence. And confidence, when it's built on tradition, can become a trap. The French have been taught that the mounted charge is the final argument. They've seen it work. They've built their identities around it. Many of them cannot imagine a world where it fails, not decisively, not publicly, not in front of so many banners. Edward, standing on his hill, is betting that it will fail today. Not because the French are foolish, not because knights are weak, but because the battlefield Edward has prepared is designed to punish the exact things aristocratic armies struggle with: impatience, competition for glory, and the tendency to treat discipline as optional when you believe victory is owed. So when you look at Crécy with modern eyes, it stops being a fairy tale about an underdog weapon. It becomes something colder and more instructive. Edward is setting conditions. He's reducing the number of decisions his men have to make under stress. He's making the French spend energy, time, and cohesion just to reach him. And he's making sure that when they arrive tired, disordered, and exposed to overlapping pressure. He's not trying to be heroic. He's trying to be inevitable. And as the light fades and the French movement thickens below the hill, Edward's plan has one final requirement, one command that turns preparation into outcome. Hold the line, hold the hill, let the enemy come. Because on this slope, the old world is about to collide with a new kind of war, one built not on spectacle, but on structure.
Philip VI didn't choose this kind of crisis, but he inherited it, along with a kingdom that expected him to solve it with spectacle. When the French army finally arrives near Crécy, it doesn't look like a neat, modern force. It looks like an entire social order on horseback. Great lords ride with their household troops. Banners and pennons snap in the wind. Fleur-de-lis, family crests, the bright signatures of power. Horses press shoulder to shoulder. Armor shines when the clouds allow it. And everywhere you look, you can feel the same belief humming beneath the metal. This is what victory is supposed to look like. Philip has gathered a host that chroniclers describe in awe. The exact number is debated. Medieval sources love to inflate. But what matters is the scale. It's in the tens of thousands. Some estimates land around 20 to 30,000. The English on the hill are fewer, perhaps 10 to 15,000. Whatever the exact totals, the imbalance is real enough to be felt. And in a medieval world, numbers are only part of the advantage. The deeper advantage is cultural. For generations, French nobility has been raised on a doctrine as much as a tactic. The mounted charge, delivered by armored knights, is the decisive act of war. It's not just military practice, it's identity. It's the story they tell themselves about why they rule. Infantry can support, mercenaries can soften a line, but the final argument, the moment that proves who is meant to dominate, is supposed to come in a thunder of hooves. Philip knows that story. His nobles know it better. Many of them have spent their lives rehearsing it in tournaments, in duels, in every ritual where honor is measured by forward motion. That becomes Philip's first problem at Crécy. He isn't simply commanding soldiers, he is managing expectations. A modern army is built to obey a chain of command. A medieval host is often a coalition of powerful men, each with his own pride, his own rivalries, his own followers, and his own definition of what honor requires. Philip can issue an order, but an order has to travel through layers of ego before it becomes action. And on this day, the army arrives late in the afternoon, tired from the march, with the English already in position on higher ground. Philip can see in a single glance what every sensible commander would see. His men need time, they need to rest, they need to form properly. They need to attack tomorrow, not now. So Philip tries to slow the machine down. He signals, he speaks, he urges patience. He wants to control the tempo. But the tempo is already slipping away. Because for many of his nobles, waiting feels like weakness. Waiting feels like giving the English time to breathe. Waiting feels like admitting, even for a moment, that this might be harder than expected. And in an honor culture, admitting uncertainty is often more dangerous than making a mistake. So you start to see it, little movements that don't look dramatic, but change everything. A few lords begin to edge forward, eager to be first. Others follow, not wanting to be left behind. Men shift their lances, horses turn their heads uphill. The front starts to move not because Philip commands it, but because the crowd of nobility begins to decide. In modern terms, Philip is facing internal misalignment. He has assembled immense combat power, but it's not synchronized. The incentives of the individuals inside the host are not aligned with the needs of the whole. Everyone wants to win, but they want to win in a way that puts their name at the center of the story. That's not just an emotional problem, it's a tactical one. Because the moment your attack starts in fragments, little surges instead of a coordinated sequence, you lose the ability to combine your strengths. Missile troops can't be protected properly. Infantry can't support cavalry properly. Reserves can't be timed properly. And once the front gets disordered, it becomes very hard to recover in the middle of a field. Philip's second problem is that he's not fighting only England. He's fighting gravity, mud, and time. The sky has been wet, the ground is heavy. The approach to the English hill is already becoming a funnel, tightened by terrain, tightened by congestion, tightened by the simple fact that too many mounted men cannot occupy the same space without slowing each other down. And yet, even with all of that, the French host still looks unstoppable, especially from inside it. The banners, the armor, the sheer number of horses, it creates a sense of inevitability. That sense is dangerous because it can make an army believe the details don't matter. But details always matter. Among Philip's forces are professional mercenaries, the Genoese crossbowmen. They're experienced, disciplined, and expensive. In a well-orchestrated plan, they would be used carefully, screened by pivices, supported by men-at-arms, timed to disrupt the enemy before the cavalry commits. But orchestration is exactly what Philip is losing. And woven into this gathering storm is another presence that makes the day feel almost mythic: John of Bohemia. John rides with his court and knights, an allied king who is by this time blind. He cannot see the English line on the hill. He cannot see the stakes or the ditches, but he can feel the mood of the army, the impatience, the certainty, the hunger for glory. He has come because kings of this age are expected to be seen in history's hardest moments. Presence is political capital. Presence is proof. So the valley below Crécy becomes crowded not just with soldiers, but with symbols of nobility, of kingship, of the old rules of war. Philip sits at the center of it all, trying to hold the shape of an army that wants to become a stampede. And up on the hill, Edward is doing the opposite. Edward's line is quiet, still, braced, prepared. That contrast is the hinge of Crécy. French motion versus English stillness. Philip is trying to command an army that believes it has already won. Edward is commanding an army that knows it must not break. One side is being pulled forward by pride. The other is being held in place by discipline. And as the afternoon light fades and the first elements of the French advance begin to drift uphill against Philip's preference, the battle starts the way many disasters start, not with a clear plan, but with momentum that nobody can fully control.
War is often decided by things nobody writes songs about. Not the charge, not the banner, not the speech before the first advance. Sometimes it's decided by a strap that isn't where it should be, a wagon that's a few minutes behind, or something as small as a piece of string that got wet at the wrong time. At Crécy, that small thing is the rain. It comes and goes in hard bursts, the kind that doesn't just soak cloth, it changes the ground, changes the air, changes what weapons can do. The slope turns slick, the valley becomes glue. And for the men who fight at distance, rain isn't just discomfort, it's performance. On the English Ridge, the longbowmen treat weather like a normal problem. They've lived outdoors, they've practiced in wind and drizzle for years. So when the sky opens, they do something simple and practiced. They unstring their bows and keep the strings dry under their helmets and cloaks. Spare strings are kept close, protected from damp. It's quiet discipline, the kind of discipline that looks boring, right up until it saves lives. Down in the French low ground, the mood is different. France has assembled a host that looks like victory, nobles in armor, bright heraldry, and behind them professional mercenaries, Genoese crossbowmen, brought in for their reputation and skill. In a well-timed plan, the Genoese would advance with their pavises, those tall shields they can hide behind while reloading, then trade fire steadily while the cavalry is held back and organized. That's how crossbow units survive and stay effective. But Crécy is not unfolding like a well-timed plan. The French arrival has been late, the host compressed, the nobility impatient. Orders are shouted, debated, ignored, swallowed by the movement of bodies. And when the Genoese are pushed forward, many of their pavises are not in place, delayed with baggage, tangled in the chaos, or simply not where they need to be at the moment it matters. So the Genoese step forward to a distance where they think their bolts will count, something like 150 yards, give or take, depending on the ground and visibility. Their officers signal, the line raises crossbows, the first volley goes out. And a lot of bolts don't land where they need to. Some strike, yes, but too many thud into the wet earth short of the ridge, or lose their bite in the wind and damp. The Genoese begin the slow process of reloading, because a crossbow is a mechanical promise. It hits hard, but it takes time to reset. Then the English answer, not with a single shot, but with a collective motion, thousands of bowstrings snapping forward nearly together. You don't just hear it, you feel it. It's like a sudden gust passing through wood and linen. Arrows rise in high arcs and begin to fall into the valley like a change of weather. And now the tempo difference becomes everything. A longbowman can shoot, knock, draw, and shoot again in a rhythm that feels almost continuous. A crossbowman has to span, set, load, aim, fire, then repeat. Under ideal conditions, it's manageable. Under pressure, in the open, in damp air, it becomes a race you can't win. The Genoese try to hold. They crouch, they lift what small shields they have. They attempt to keep their spacing. They are professionals, and professionals don't break easily. But the valley is offering them no mercy. No pavis wall to hide behind, no time to reload safely, and the ridge that never stops producing arrows. So their line begins to waver. Not dramatically at first, it's small steps, a backward lean, men turning their heads, officers trying to pull them into place with gestures and shouted cues. The problem is that discipline can't create cover out of thin air. Discipline can't make the reload cycle of a crossbow shorter. Discipline can't make damp string behave like dry string. And behind them is the worst possible audience, French nobles who see any backward movement as disgrace. In that moment, the social structure of the French host works against itself. The Genoese are hired hands in the eyes of many aristocrats, useful but not respected. So when the Genoese begin drifting back to survive, the nobles behind them react with anger and contempt, treating them as obstacles rather than allies. You can see it in the way horses press forward into the retreating line, in the way knights gesture sharply, trying to force a path, in the way the front becomes crowded, with too many bodies trying to move in opposite directions on ground that punishes every step. From a modern perspective, this is command and control collapsing in real time. Philip has the pieces for a combined attack: missile troops, infantry, cavalry, but sequencing is everything, and sequencing is exactly what impatience destroys. When the front is disordered, every new movement adds friction, every delay becomes a shove, every shove becomes a jam. On the English hill, Edward doesn't need to gamble. He only needs to keep the system running. His archers keep their cadence. His men-at-arms stay braced. Nobody rushes downhill. Nobody chases glory. The plan does not require brilliance in the moment. It requires steadiness. And in the valley, the old world begins to show its weakness. Not lack of courage, but lack of coordination. The Genoese are pushed back through their own allies. The French nobles surge forward, impatient to simplify the problem with cavalry. But what they're actually doing is stepping into a funnel, uphill, into prepared ground, through mud and mist, against an enemy who is calm enough to let them come. And as the last of the rain fades and the light starts to drop, the battle shifts gears. The professional crossbowmen, meant to open the way, are no longer opening anything. Now the knights will try to do what knights have always done. They will try to make the past work one more time. From the French side, the answer feels obvious. If the front is messy, if the crossbowmen are wavering and the approach is clogged, then simplify it. Do what always works. Send in the knights. This isn't stupidity in the cartoonish way people sometimes imagine. It's doctrine. It's identity. For centuries, the mounted charge has been the signature move of aristocratic war. It's the moment that turns a battlefield into a decision. The sound, the weight, the forward certainty. Everything in the medieval imagination says that when armored horsemen commit, ordinary men break. But Crécy isn't a tournament field. The slope is wet. The ground is chewed up by earlier movement. The approach is already full of bodies trying to move in opposite directions. And a charge is not just courage, it's space and timing. A charge needs clean lanes. It needs momentum. It needs cohesion. Without those, it's not a spear point. It's a crowd trying to become a spear while already tripping over itself. Still, when the French knights begin their climb, it is impressive. You can't deny that. Even through mist and fading light, it looks like a moving wall of prestige. Heraldry flashes, metal darkens with water, horses surge forward, hooves tearing at the mud, riders leaning low as if the sheer force of will can hold the formation together. Up on the hill, the English line doesn't flinch. Edward's archers don't need to argue about honor. They don't need to pick out who is noble. They only need to do what they've been trained to do: keep the air busy. And here is the part that matters most, the part films often miss. The archers don't have to defeat armor in some magical one-shot way. They can defeat cavalry by defeating what makes cavalry work: the horse. A horse is powerful, but it is not a machine. Under a storm of arrows, horses shy, stumble, refuse, rear. Even the bravest animal can't maintain perfect forward drive when the world around it becomes pain and panic and noise. And once a horse falters on a slope, it doesn't just affect the rider, it becomes an obstacle for everyone behind it. A fallen horse is a barricade. A barricade creates congestion. Congestion kills momentum. And momentum is the heart of the mounted charge. You can see it happening in seconds. The front begins to slow, not because every rider is struck, but because the formation loses its clean flow. One horse hesitates at the stakes, another slides in mud and has to recover. A rider swerves to avoid a gap or a body and bumps into the next man. The neat line becomes an uneven wave, and that wave breaks on the hill's prepared teeth. Edward's stakes do their quiet work. Ditches and rough ground do theirs. None of it looks heroic, but all of it is brutally effective. The French aren't meeting a scattered enemy they can ride down. They are meeting a braced barrier behind obstacles, with arrows cutting into timing and space. Some knights reach the contact line anyway. Some press close enough to test the English men-at-arms. They expect that final shove, the impact that breaks the door. But Edward's men-at-arms are not running. They are not chasing. They are holding. They stand like a beam across a doorway. The French expected a chase. They have met a door that does not open. From Edward's side, the battle becomes a sequence of problems to manage, not a story to perform. Keep the archers supplied, keep the line unbroken, prevent local gaps, watch the flanks, stay calm so the army stays calm. The decisions are simple, but the discipline to stick to them when the enemy is in front of you and adrenaline is begging you to rush forward, that discipline is rare. From Philip's side, everything becomes harder with every minute. He has to restore order. He has to get units through clogged approaches. He has to stop nobles from charging independently. He has to coordinate troops that are already mixing together in the mud. He has to keep morale from curdling into blame. It's not a clean fight against England anymore. It's a fight against the friction of the field and the friction inside his own host. And the light is fading. Somewhere among the French, John of Bohemia rides with his companions, listening to the sound of the battlefield more than seeing it, sensing through distance and vibration that something is wrong with the story France expected to tell. On the hill, Edward watches the French attacks change shape. He sees the pressure build and break and build again. He doesn't need to celebrate each moment of French disorder. He simply needs to not ruin his own advantage by moving at the wrong time. And that's the temptation, the great temptation of defenders. When the enemy begins to recoil, you want to surge forward. You want to turn defense into pursuit. Pursuit is where victories become total. Pursuit is where ransoms and reputations are collected. Edward does not allow it, because he understands probability. If his line runs downhill, he gives up the hill. He gives up the stakes and ditches. He turns his disciplined wall into scattered men on slippery ground, exactly the kind of target the French could still exploit if they managed to reform even a portion of their cavalry. Edward is not trying to win a glamorous moment. He's trying to win the day. So he holds his army back, even as arrows continue to fall, even as French riders struggle to find lanes, even as the approach grows more choked with every renewed attempt. Edward's plan is not a script that requires perfect timing. It's a trap that gets stronger when the enemy becomes disorganized. In modern language, the English are cycling faster. They observe, they orient, they decide, they act. Quickly, consistently, without internal argument. The French, weighed down by status and impatience, are cycling slower. Their decisions compete with each other. Their movements interfere with each other. Their strength becomes friction. And as the first charge loses shape and the next one begins to form behind it, the battlefield feels like it's cracking, not the earth itself, but an assumption. The assumption that noble cavalry is the final answer. At Crécy, the hill doesn't care who you are. The mud doesn't care what your family name means. Arrows don't care what traditions demand. Only physics cares, and Edward has placed his army where physics works for him. The knights will come again. They almost have to, because the social engine of chivalry doesn't like retreat, hesitation, or resetting. It demands forward motion. It demands display. But the hill has begun to teach a new lesson, and it will repeat it as long as the French keep insisting on the old one. Hold, stay still, let the enemy spend itself. Because on this slope, the past is trying to charge into the future, and the future is not moving. By the time the fighting has been going on for hours, Crécy no longer feels like a single battle. It feels like a grinding storm. Surges, pauses, sudden violence, and then the next wave, all under a sky that can't decide if it wants to rain or simply smother the world in damp gray.
Somewhere inside the French host rides a king who cannot see any of it. John of Bohemia has been blind for years. He can't look up the slope and judge the English position. He can't watch banners advance or measure how quickly the ground is turning to mud. What he has instead is sound. Hoofbeats that begin strong and then break into confusion, shouting that rises and falls, the distant, steady rhythm of arrows that makes the air itself feel occupied. And if you listen closely, an army tells you the truth. A confident army sounds like forward motion. It sounds clean, commands carry. People believe their own momentum. A struggling army sounds different. It has interruptions, stops and starts, voices calling for space, men asking where to go, units bumping into each other because the plan has dissolved into instinct. John hears that change. He hears that something is going wrong with the story France expected to tell today. John didn't come to France because it was practical. He came because medieval kings were expected to be present when history demanded witnesses. Presence was political currency. Presence proved loyalty. Presence kept allies from doubting. And for John himself, presence meant something deeper. Blindness had taken his sight, but he refused to let it take his place in the world. In a modern sense, you could call it identity. When people lose control over one part of their life, they cling harder to the parts they can still choose. John can't choose what he sees, but he can choose where his horse turns. He can choose whether he withdraws or advances. He can choose what kind of ending his story will have. As reports filter back, fragmented, contradictory, emotionally charged, John's circle tightens around him. His knights lean in close, speaking into the damp wind. Their faces give away more than their words. They know what he's considering, and they're torn between loyalty and dread. John listens. Then he makes a decision that will outlive the mud. He will go forward. Chroniclers later put dramatic lines into his mouth, something like, "A king does not flee." We can't know the exact words. Medieval writers loved a good sentence, the kind that fits perfectly into a legend. But we don't need the exact quote to understand the truth behind it. John advanced when the sensible choice would have been to stay back and preserve himself. And the men around him, in a gesture that is both practical and symbolic, do something extraordinary. They link themselves to him. They tie reins together, John's horse connected to the horses of his companions, so that even without sight, he is guided into the press by men who refuse to abandon him. It's a small act of rope and leather, but it feels like myth because of what it represents. Not just courage, but commitment, a choice made together, without illusion. Then that little formation begins to move through the French host, not as a glorious charge, not like a tournament display, but as a determined push through fog, bodies, and uncertainty. Horses step carefully in mud. Torchlight flickers in the mist. Banners loom and vanish like ghosts as the line threads toward the sound of the thickest fighting. From the English ridge, John isn't visible as John. To most archers, a noble cluster is a noble cluster. Dark shapes, armored men, fine gear, escorted movement. They don't recognize a king by name in the fog. They only recognize that something valuable is coming uphill with a tight escort. Edward's system responds the way a system responds. Archers keep cadence. Men-at-arms hold the line. Nobody breaks formation for the romance of it. The hill remains a machine, and the machine doesn't care who's inside it. John's formation reaches the crowded edge of contact, where horses bunch, where space disappears, where the world becomes sound and pressure more than sight. His companions lift shields, they brace, they try to keep him upright and moving forward. And John, blind, does what he came to do. He raises his sword and strikes toward the sound, one restrained motion, not theatrical, simply human. A king insisting that even now he can still act. What happens next is the part history can't record cleanly. Too many bodies, too much fog, too much motion in too little space. The chronicles give us the shape, not the mechanics. John and the knights tied to him do not come back. When the field finally quiets enough for names to be matched to the fallen, John is found among his companions, still bound by the linked reins that brought him forward. Even if details shift in retelling, that image holds because it captures a truth the medieval mind recognized instantly. This was the old code made visible at the moment the old code was failing. And then the story takes on its lasting emblem. Edward's son, Edward of Woodstock, later remembered as the Black Prince, is said to have taken John's personal badge, the ostrich feathers and the motto, Ich dien, meaning I serve. That emblem becomes associated with the Prince of Wales. Whether the exact transfer happened precisely as later legend describes is debated, because medieval heraldry and storytelling often tidy reality into a clean moral shape. But the association is real, the symbolism is real, and it tells us something important. Even as warfare becomes more technical, more system-driven, more about preparation and pressure, people still hunger for meaning. They still want the moment of dignity to carry out of the mud. From a modern perspective, John's final advance doesn't change the battle's outcome. It doesn't solve Philip's collapsing command. It doesn't break Edward's line. But it does something else. It becomes the human face of an era ending. Edward is building a future where discipline and design matter more than aristocratic certainty. Philip is trapped inside a system where authority has to compete with pride. And John, blind, determined, guided forward by loyal hands, becomes the last bright symbol of the old idea that honor alone can define reality. Night comes on fast at Crécy, and it doesn't bring clarity. It brings fog, torchlight, and the kind of confusion that makes even a huge army feel blind. Down in the French low ground, the battlefield has become a machine that eats timing. Every new attempt to push uphill runs into the wreckage of the last one. Mud churned into paste, lanes narrowed by bodies and horses, men trying to move forward through men trying to move back. What should have been a clean sequence of missile troops, infantry support, and then cavalry shock is now just pressure. Uneven, impatient pressure, pushing into the same tight throat again and again. And at the center of it all is Philip VI. People sometimes imagine medieval kings as absolute commanders, but in moments like this, you see the truth. Philip isn't directing a modern army. He's trying to steer a crowd of powerful men, each of them armed, each of them proud, each of them convinced that glory is slipping away every second they're not at the front. So Philip fights two battles at once. One is against Edward's disciplined line on the hill, the other is against the momentum of his own nobility. Everywhere around him, movement keeps happening even when he signals for it to stop. Banners drift forward, knights press through gaps, messengers try to cut lanes and get swallowed by the crush. In fog and torchlight, even a king's authority can feel like just another voice in the noise. And here's the most modern part of it. The longer it goes wrong, the harder it becomes to admit it's wrong. Because every failed push creates pressure to try again. Not necessarily because the next attempt is smarter, but because stopping feels like humiliation. It's sunk cost, medieval style. Reputation, pride, and the fear of being judged by other nobles more than by the enemy. So the front keeps churning. Small groups attempt fresh thrusts uphill. Horses accelerate, then brake as the corridor clogs again. Lances lower, then tilt awkwardly because there isn't room to use them properly. The old doctrine is trying to assert itself, but the battlefield geometry won't cooperate. Up on the ridge, Edward's advantage is that he doesn't need to improvise. He only needs to maintain the system.
The English line stays fixed behind its stakes and shallow ditches. The men-at-arms hold steady, shield rims touching, spear butts planted. The archers keep their rhythm, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but always controlled, always purposeful. And most importantly, Edward keeps his men from doing the one thing medieval soldiers most want to do when the enemy recoils: chase. He doesn't let victory turn into disorder. From a modern viewpoint, it's discipline as a weapon. Edward has reduced the number of decisions his men must make in the most stressful moments. Their job is simple: hold the line, keep pressure on the approach, don't break shape. That simplicity is exactly what makes it durable. Philip doesn't get that luxury. His job is to rebuild order in the middle of moving chaos. And as night deepens, he reaches the point every commander dreads. The moment where continuing is no longer bravery, it's just waste. Darkness doesn't improve control, it destroys it. Signals are harder to see, lines are harder to form, units blend, panic spreads faster than instructions. The field becomes a place where a single misunderstood movement can ripple into disaster. Philip's advisors press close. In the torchlight, their faces are tight, their gestures clipped and urgent. They are not trying to rob the king of honor. They are trying to preserve the kingdom's remaining strength. They are trying to save Philip himself, because a king lost on the field can become a political collapse far larger than any single defeat. Philip hesitates because he knows what it means. A king leaving the field, even for practical reasons, can be interpreted as weakness, and in a medieval court, perceptions harden into rumors fast. But there is a point where leadership becomes choosing what survives. Philip gives the order to disengage. Not a dramatic flight, not a collapse into chaos, at least not immediately. More like a forced withdrawal, guided by his household knights, carving a narrow lane through the press. Horses pivot carefully in mud, guards tighten around him, torches bob and sway as the escort moves away from the thickest fighting. And even this is difficult, because Philip is boxed in by the very people who came to prove his power. On the retreat road, hedgerows loom like dark walls, and the fog turns torchlight into halos. Riders glance back repeatedly, checking whether the field behind them is collapsing or simply fading into the night. The king's escort moves at a controlled pace, because speed on wet ground is its own risk. Back at Crécy, the battle doesn't end in a clean line. It diminishes. The French front continues to churn in pockets, some groups still trying to push uphill, others trying to pull away, all of them working through the same congestion that has been growing for hours. Without central control and night closing in, the effort becomes less and less coherent. Up on the hill, Edward stays exactly where he is. That decision might be the most important one of the night. A less disciplined army would spill downhill in pursuit and turn a strong defensive position into a scattered mess. Edward refuses. His line holds. The archers remain ready. The men-at-arms stay braced behind the stakes. And as the noise drops, the English begin to do what disciplined forces do after a fight: secure the perimeter. Small patrols move a few steps beyond the stake line, careful and deliberate. No sprinting, no reckless searching, just cautious movement, armor heavy, boots sinking slightly into wet earth. They pause, listen, then continue. The hill remains guarded, not abandoned to excitement. By the time the first hint of morning starts to pale the horizon, the scale of what happened is still hard to accept. The fog thins in places. The slope reveals itself, the stakes, the ditches, the churned approach lanes that turned French strength into friction. Philip has gone into the dark to regroup and rebuild a story that has cracked. Edward remains on the ridge, not celebrating, not chasing, just holding the ground because he understands what Crécy has become. Not a moment of glory, but a lesson. A lesson in what happens when discipline meets impatience, when preparation meets tradition, when a king's authority meets an aristocracy. Morning at Crécy doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives with fog, cold light, and the strange quiet that follows a night of confusion, when the air feels heavier because the shouting is gone. On the ridge, the English are still in control of their posture, not celebrating, not rushing downhill, just moving carefully as if the battlefield might still bite. Small patrols step beyond the stakes. Boots sink and pull free with that soft, sticky sound only wet ground makes. Cloaks hang damp. Armor looks darker in daylight, less like pageantry and more like work. As the fog begins to thin, the shape of the fight becomes clearer. The slope isn't just a hill anymore, it's a diagram. Stakes, shallow ditches, churned lanes where movement narrowed into a funnel. You can almost read the story in the ground, where momentum died, where formations compressed, where one problem became 10. English archers move down the slope in measured steps, collecting what they can. They pick up arrows that are still usable. They wipe mud off shafts and check fletching with quick, practiced hands. It's not heroic, it's practical. And that practicality is part of why Edward's army is still standing where it started. Then the counting begins. Not the dramatic counting that chroniclers love, where numbers turn into moral lessons and divine judgment. This is the quieter kind. Heralds identifying coats of arms, officers recognizing banners, clerks at a makeshift table writing tallies onto damp parchment. Names matter because nobles are recorded. Common soldiers often become a blur in the record, even when they did most of the work. And this is where the legend and the reality separate a little. You'll hear famous claims that the English lost only a handful of men, numbers so small they sound like myth. You'll hear claims that the French lost an unimaginable amount in a single afternoon. Medieval writers weren't accountants. They were storytellers, propagandists, moralists, and sometimes witnesses whose memories had already been shaped by shock. The more honest modern picture is still staggering but less magical. English losses were likely in the hundreds, not in the dozens. French losses were likely several thousand overall, with a heavy proportion of nobles and knights among them. Enough high-ranking dead that chroniclers could fill pages with names and titles. Even after you correct the exaggerations, the imbalance remains real, and the meaning doesn't change. A smaller, disciplined force on prepared ground defeated a larger host that couldn't coordinate its strengths. That's the important part. Crécy wasn't a miracle, it was a systems victory. It proved something that modern warfare takes for granted. The outcome isn't decided only by courage or status. It's decided by terrain, sequencing, logistics, and cohesion under pressure. Edward didn't win because his men were superhuman. He won because his plan remained stable, while the French plan broke into competing impulses. And the psychological shock goes deeper than the numbers. In medieval warfare, noblemen often expected capture and ransom more than death. Reputation mattered, wealth mattered, rank mattered. But on that muddy slope, rank didn't create a shield against a storm of arrows or against congestion on a narrow approach. The battlefield treated everyone like weight and distance and timing. That's what really rattles Europe. Not just that France lost, but that so many members of the ruling class were lost in a way that felt indiscriminate. Because if a common archer can end a noble's day from far away, then what does noble blood actually guarantee? That question doesn't get asked openly at first, not in the way modern people argue in public, but it starts to appear in whispers, in private letters, in the uneasy silence of councils when the missing seats become obvious. Back in the English camp, Edward doesn't linger for a victory parade. He does what effective commanders do. He turns success into advantage. He moves on. The campaign target is clear: Calais, a port that can anchor English operations on the continent, a gateway that can feed future campaigns. Crécy is not the end of the story, it's the door that swings open. So the English begin to break camp, fold tents, load carts, and reform columns. Longbows go back over shoulders, wagons grind through mud ruts. The army moves with the same discipline that held the ridge, because Edward understands that winning a battle is only useful if you can still move afterward. And in France, Philip faces a different kind of work. He has to rebuild an army, yes, but also a narrative. He has to reassure allies. He has to manage nobles who are furious, grieving, and also quietly afraid of what this battle suggests. He has to restore command authority after a day when impatience, rivalry, and tradition proved stronger than royal signals. In the months and years after Crécy, France adapts, slowly, unevenly, sometimes reluctantly. More missile troops, more attention to defensive posture, more respect for coordination, not because the French suddenly become less brave, but because doctrine has been challenged in public, and public challenges are hard to ignore forever. And hovering behind all of it is the next transformation waiting on the horizon. The longbow is powerful, but it demands a lifetime of training. You can't build an army of expert longbowmen overnight. It takes culture. If you strip away the poetry and the speeches that chroniclers love to invent, Crécy still tells a clear story across 7 centuries. It says something simple and uncomfortable. A society's favorite myth is not the same thing as battlefield reality. Edward III didn't win because Englishmen were magically braver or because France suddenly forgot how to fight. He won because he built a plan that stayed solid when conditions got ugly. He chose ground that made the enemy pay to reach him. He prepared obstacles that stole speed and broke formation. He put his archers where their fire overlapped, and he kept his men-at-arms steady on foot so the line wouldn't wobble. And maybe most importantly, he kept his army from doing the thing medieval warriors wanted most, charging downhill to chase a story. He treated the battle like engineering, not romance. From a modern point of view, that's the heart of it. Edward's victory was an early triumph of process, a system designed to work under stress. Simple instructions, clear roles, tight formations, and discipline strong enough to resist temptation. Philip VI, meanwhile, didn't just lose a fight, he lost control of a structure that was never fully built for control. His army was enormous, but it wasn't unified in the way we'd recognize today. It was a coalition of powerful nobles, each one a leader in his own right, each one carrying pride like a second suit of armor. In that kind of force, command is always a negotiation. Every order has to pass through ego. Every delay feels like an insult. Every retreat becomes an accusation. So Philip faced a problem that feels surprisingly modern, a leadership crisis inside his own organization, competing incentives, status overriding coordination, momentum replacing planning. And when that happens, even a king can be pulled along by the crowd. Crécy also leaves us with John of Bohemia, the blind king whose final decision becomes a symbol of the old code. Whatever exact words he spoke, his action makes sense inside his world. He chose presence over prudence. He chose meaning over survival. He wanted to be part of the moment when fate turned, even if he could only hear it. To modernize, it's tragic and almost unreal, but it reminds us of something important. People don't live inside tactics, they live inside meanings, and when the world changes, they cling to the meanings that shape them. That's why John's story endures. It's the human face of an era refusing to disappear quietly. But the battle's deeper shock wasn't just that French knights failed to break the English line. It was what that failure implied. For centuries, the mounted knight had been more than a soldier. He was a social argument. He was proof that nobility had a purpose, that birth and training in armor produced a superior kind of man. The battlefield was supposed to confirm that hierarchy. At Crécy, the field didn't confirm it, because arrows don't care about lineage, mud doesn't care about titles, and a prepared position doesn't care how beautiful your banner looks in the wind. And here's the irony. People often call the longbow a cheap peasant weapon, but that's only half true. The bow itself is simple, yes, but the ability to field thousands of skilled longbowmen isn't cheap at all. It's the result of long-term policy and culture, practice, tradition, supply, leadership willing to trust common soldiers with the decisive role. In modern terms, the longbowmen were not an accident. They were a national investment paying dividends. So Crécy didn't end cavalry, it ended cavalry's monopoly. Knights would still matter. Mounted troops would still be useful for scouting, flanking, pursuit, and shock in the right conditions. Armor would evolve. Tactics would change. The medieval world wouldn't vanish overnight. But after Crécy, it becomes much harder to pretend that the charge alone is destiny. And that shift, away from individual heroics and toward coordinated pressure, is why military historians keep coming back to this muddy slope. Crécy rewards what modern doctrine rewards: preparation, positioning, integration, and discipline under stress. And then time keeps moving, as it always does. The longbow's dominance doesn't last forever, partly because it demands years of training. You can't create elite longbowmen in a season. But gunpowder weapons, awkward at first, unreliable at first, keep improving, and they offer something every ruler wants: power that can be scaled faster, taught quicker, produced in greater numbers. The weapon that helped break the old order would eventually be overtaken by an even more disruptive one. So when you picture the end of Crécy, don't picture a triumphant parade, picture something quieter. Edward standing on the hill, still controlling his line even after victory, because he knows the real danger is losing discipline at the wrong moment. Philip riding away into the dark, not only wounded in body and reputation, but forced to face questions no king wants to hear. How do you command an elite that refuses to be managed? How do you rebuild belief after the battlefield has contradicted it? And John of Bohemia, blind, bound to loyal companions, moving towards the sound of history, becoming legend, not because he changed the outcome, but because he embodied the code that the outcome was quietly dismantling. Crécy didn't just change a campaign, it changed an assumption. It showed Europe that tradition can be outperformed, that numbers can be neutralized, and that the future often arrives not with a trumpet, but with a system that refuses to break.